I'm not claiming expertise. I'm just sharing some of my thoughts on these issues. Does anyone know where this is? This picture? That is Zimbabwe. This is when you hear about Zimbabwe, this is classically the feature called Zimbabwe. And actually, I was delighted to go there. So, the topic is towards responsible governance. I think most people would want to know, what do we mean when we say responsible governance? It's a topic that has been in discourse in the global arena for a long time, so we probably don't need to reinvent the wheel. What I've chosen to do is to very briefly introduce two measures of development, or two indices commonly used in the development agenda. And one of this is the Sustainable Development Goals. So globally, we know that the UN Development Framework came together beginning in 1992 and has updated this. We had the Millennium Development Goals, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can benchmark our development efforts against the Sustainable Development Goals. And those goals have a number of targets and indicators, goals and targets and indicators. Those have to do with these variables that you see on screen. In all, there are about 17 of those. One of the things that I found interesting is that neither energy nor security are part of this. And maybe during the discussion, we might explore the question as to why those are not represented. But this is one measure that we can assess the degree to which we are developing our measure our efforts against the targets and goals and indicators set by the Sustainable Development Goals. The other is the Social Development Index. So the United Nations, in collaboration with a number of development agencies, came up with a number of factors to measure development. And they include many of the indicators that we see here: nutrition and basic care, water and sanitation, all the way to access to advanced education. I think it's reasonable to agree that a country that is providing these services, these amenities for its citizens, and providing it to them effectively, probably can assess the degree to which it is developing, or not developed. So as we talk about development in Tivland and in Benue, these are some of the frames that we can use. How well are we doing on the base relative to these indicators? How well would we like to be doing? I think those gives us some benchmarks for comparison. So if you look at the Social Progress Index, or the Social Development Index, it ranks countries, globally I think it's 180 countries, maybe 160, in terms of various categories or tiers of development. So tier 1, we see the most developed countries with Norway, Denmark. The Scandinavian countries almost always at the top of the development agenda, the best developed countries. Here are the tier 2 countries. So these countries are rated against these variables that you just saw. You can see how well it's a maximum score is 100. Tier 2 countries, tier 3 countries, and here is Nigeria, tier 5. So I know this is not Benue State, but we don't have the data for Benue State, so we can use Nigeria as where we belong. What I found sobering as I looked at this data is the countries that we belong with. Côte d'Ivoire, that has had a war since about 2000, it still ranks better than Nigeria. Rwanda, Zimbabwe, typically when you think about Nigeria and the resources we have, both mineral as well as personnel, this is not where we ought to be. Like just anecdotally, you wouldn't think that we would be in this category. So to be tier 5 out of 6 tiers, and to be with Equatorial Guinea, Haiti, Sudan, I think it's very sobering for me when I look at where Nigeria belongs, certainly what other people think about Nigeria. The other thing I'll mention that I feel doesn't get quite the same level of attention, but it should, is our current population increase and the impact that it's going to have on whatever we try to do going forward. So again, this data is for Nigeria. I apologize for the quality. Let me see if I can make this sharper. No, I can't. But so these are listings of the most populous countries in the world. Back in 1950, it was China and India. Nigeria didn't show up in the top list of the most populous countries at all. In 2013, 2015, Nigeria showed up as the 7th most populous country in the world. In 2050, which is 27 years from now, Nigeria is going to be either the 3rd or the 4th most populous country in the world. Think about that for a moment. In 27 years, we're going to be the 3rd or the most populous country in the world. If we have about 200 million people now, we're going to add another 200 million people in 27 years. This, for me, is the statistics that worries me more than almost anything else. It's the statistics that alarms me more than almost anything else we think about. We worry about corruption, and we should. We worry about underdevelopment, and we should. But this worries me more than anything else. Why does it worry me? If we have 200 million people now, take almost any sector you want, education. We don't have enough universities. We don't have enough lecturers. In order for us to maintain the same quality of education in Nigeria that we have now, the same quality, not an improvement, we have to be establishing 30 new universities every year for the next 30 years. Nigeria needs 30 new universities every year for the next 30 years just to maintain the quality of education we have now. That's not an improvement. And right now, access to higher education, you saw one of those slides, access to advanced education is one of the variables that we measure development. Right now, access to higher education in Nigeria is 8%. The global average is 22%. We are way below the level of higher education that we should be providing. And we are not going to make progress, because even if we could establish 30 new universities, who is going to fund them? Who is going to teach in those universities? Look at food, employment, infrastructure. If people have no employment now, in 30 years, a lot of people in this room are going to be alive in 30 years. There's going to be twice as many people looking for school, looking for food, looking for housing, looking for employment. How are we going to provide those things? And if we don't, what does it mean for the future of our country? So this worries me. But you can see where China was number 1 in 2015. Now India is number 1. Certainly in 2050, India will be number 1. China will be number 2. And it's going to be either Nigeria or the US, depending on which projection model you use. Some projections put Nigeria ahead of the US, some put the US. But regardless, we are going to be number 3, no matter what projection you use. And there's a lot of implications for that. So that's the frame that I think about when I think about development. And so I've come up with a personal view. I'd like to preface this again with the caveat that I'm not an expert, but based on observations and experiences, here are some personal thoughts about what I think we need to be doing if we really want to lay the foundation for development, not just for Benue State, but for Nigeria. Number 1, I think what is critically lacking is leadership by example. We need to have leaders who lead by example. It is too often the case that our leaders are the very problem and the very inhibitors, impediments to development. I think we need to have a smaller government. We spend far too much money on governance, money that we don't have. And I'd like to talk about this community or village-based development. I'll talk about that. A focus on a limited number of priorities and the concept of identity. I think that we frequently underestimate or ignore what's the impact of people having a shared identity, a sense of shared purpose and shared destiny does in terms of development. And of course, here, accountability and meritocracy. I think these are the things that, in my opinion, will underpin any effort, any meaningful efforts at sustainable and improved governance. So over the next few slides, I'm going to go over each of these very briefly. Again, I put them up just to stimulate discussion, and I'm interested in hearing what you think. What you notice is probably most professionals, if you were to ask them, this is probably not the list they would come up with, but this is the list I have come to believe based on my reflections and experience. I think one of the things we should pay attention to when I talk about leadership is our leaders need to govern as if people matter. Now, they don't govern as if people matter. So if you look at Benue State, so taking it down to our state, we have two former commissioners here sitting side by side, legislator, chairman. So one of the things you notice, one of the things that bothers me when I hear about unpaid salaries, I have a sister who teaches, and sometimes she tells me they haven't been paid for 10 months. And the first thing I ask myself is, how many months have the commissioners not been paid? It'd be interesting to hear your viewpoint as former commissioners when we discuss. How many months have the legislators not been paid? Who decides who gets paid and who doesn't get paid? These primary school teachers are making hardly any money. Even if they were paid, they're not even making enough money to see themselves to the end of the month. But when money is scarce, those are the people we refuse to pay. What if we flip that model around, right? What if we flip that model? When money is scarce, we pay the junior workers first, the executives last. No commissioner gets paid until all the people who work in that ministry have been paid. None of the members of the House of Assembly will get paid until all the junior workers get paid. The permanent secretary doesn't get paid until everybody gets paid. That's how we run our university. When money is scarce, I get paid last. Actually, it hasn't happened, but that's our principle. If money is scarce and people are going to miss their salaries, the president will be the last to get paid. You can't put yourself up front at the head of the line when you're supposed to be serving people. So I think it's just one example, but I'm going to put it out there for our discussion. If we are serious about governance, we should prioritize the people that we're elected to serve first, not prioritizing ourselves and our families and the things that we want. It'll be interesting to hear what we think about this kind of approach. A second variation of this principle is if its money is tight, pay everybody proportionately. It is unbelievable to me to hear that people haven't been paid for a year or 10 months. How are they supposed to live? How are they supposed to work? And we preside over government, and we still feel important and take on the titles of excellency, honorable. How are you honorable when you haven't paid somebody for 10 months? So it'll be interesting to me to hear those perspectives. So here is a quote that Chinua Achebe made many years ago, actually two quotes. He said, "The trouble with Nigeria is the failure of leadership. There's nothing wrong with the Nigerian people or the Nigerian water or land or water or anything else. The Nigerian problem is the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility, to the challenge of personal example leadership by example, which are the hallmarks of true leadership. I think this is the thing we lack the most. Usually the very first people to break any rules in Nigeria are the so-called big men. You stand in a line, they skip the line and go to the front. If you ask them, they'll go, do you know who I am? Why does that matter? And if you are the leader, shouldn't you be held accountable? So that lack of accountability, that lack of ability to lead by example is a problem. And here Chinua Achebe says, Nigeria is what it is because its leaders are not what they should be. I think this is a critical point. So maybe if we start electing leaders who are what they should be, maybe Nigeria will finally begin to change. But over and over, given the chances, we pick the people that we know almost guarantees to lead us to these points. The other thing Nigerian leaders are really good at is adopting democratic principles selectively. Again, I said I'll give you some personal examples. In my state, nobody can travel first class or business class apart from the government. I'm the president of my university. I'm not allowed to travel business class. When I travel economy. In fact, you're never allowed to travel business class. And there's a rule about how much money you can spend. Our leaders don't do this. They're always in first class, always in business class, and we have people who haven't been paid for 9 or 10 months. They don't suffer the consequences of the actions that they impose on people. I think we have to move to a point where they begin to see they create policies and rules that they are beneficiaries of. This doesn't happen anywhere in the world, nowhere else in the world. You cannot approve a salary increase that you are going to benefit. It doesn't happen, right? So this type of selective, we like to think about democratic principles, but we selectively adopt and apply the ones that favor us and ignore the ones that don't favor us. When we name public infrastructure in Illinois, no public servant can have an infrastructure named after them until at least 5 years after they have retired. But we always name things after governors, right? Somebody implements or renovates a school and we put a big sign, thank you, Governor Suswan. There used to be several of these. I'm not picking on Suswan, but there were several of these along the roads I used to see all the time. So this sounds like small things, but they are foundational. They are fundamental to our psyche, the way we think, the way we reason. And until we learn to get that psyche corrected, we are going to continue to be in trouble. So that's all I want to say about personal leadership. We should reduce the size and cost of government. Nigerians spend more on their leaders than almost any other country. And there's always a sense out there that there's a lot of money. It's amazing to me when I talk to even people who should know better. They say, oh, the money in Nigeria is amazing. And we just have a lot of money. I want to challenge you today and say, we don't have nearly as much money as you think. Not even by a long shot. We don't have nearly as much money as you think. Take a look at this. Again, I apologize for the quality. This is the budget, the approved budget for Nigerian states in 2023. So Lagos is, of course, at the top, $1.7 trillion. Benue State is down here at about $179 billion is our budget. Naira is our budget for the 2023 year. What is interesting about this is we can compare this to the budget of US states. Again, I wish we could get this we could make this more for you to see, but I'll read it out to you. California, which is the state that is hosting us here, has a budget of $267 billion. That's the budget of the state of California. All the way down, the next one is New York, for that's $220 billion, and so on. Why is that interesting? Because the budget of Nigeria is $43.7 billion. California, with a population of 40 million people, has a budget that is 5-6 times the budget of Nigeria for 200 million people. Even if the country was very well managed, even if we have the best leaders, we would have trouble providing the resources we need for all our people because we don't have nearly as much money as we think we do. Take another example. Benue State, I said its budget is $179 billion. That translates to, if my arithmetic is correct, $250 million. That's the whole money the state has to work with. What's our population? 5 or 6 million people? 250 million. My university has 21,000 students, 6,000 workers, so 27,000 people. Our budget is $565 million a year. Twice the budget of Benue State. Twice for 27,000 people. Even if you use all our money as effectively as you can, it's not nearly as much money as you think in order to raise people out of poverty to the levels that they need to be to have a level that we might call development. Unfortunately, we have leaders who don't understand this, who don't appreciate that. It's not as much money as you think. Maybe they've never seen $1 million naira before, so when they see this, they say, it's a lot of money. No, it's not. Mr. President here, Yanka, University of North Carolina, 32,000 students. Their budget is $4 billion. For that one university that has 32, they spend $4 billion a year. Mku is not here. Penn State has a budget of $8 billion a year. One small university has a budget 100 times the budget of Benue State. And we think there's a lot of money. There are people who say, well, but we're not spending in US dollars. Actually, you are. Because everything we import it from other countries and we pay in US dollars. And they may say, well, labor doesn't cost us much. Well, it should. The people are poor because you're not paying them enough. If we have to pay them what they need to be developed, then that money just simply goes away. And so when leaders don't realize just how tight our situation is, and begin to spend money as if there's no tomorrow, or the belief that we have a lot of money, this is what exacerbates our problem. And remember, we are going to double this population in 27 years. So, are we going to be able to double our budget in 27 years? Do you think in 27 years, Benue State will have double the productivity to support double the population? Therein lies the challenge. So, we need to make government cheaper. We need to reduce the cost of governance. I mentioned before, we copy systems, and sometimes we don't pay as much attention to how those systems operate. Here in the US, which has the presidential democratic system that we have copied, there are only 4 states where the legislators are full-time. Almost all the other states have legislators who don't work full-time. They have their jobs. The guy who represents my district in Illinois, he owns a funeral home, right? He's a funeral director. That's what his full-time job is. Being a legislator is a part-time job, and he gets paid part-time wages. Do our legislators actually have enough work to be full-time legislators? Could they not do it as part-time? And can we afford So here we saw the budget of those states I mentioned. Some of these legislators in the US states are making $18,000 a year. Some are making $40,000, about the salary of a primary school and elementary school teacher. Why do our legislators have to get more? Who decided this, and where did we copy that system from? If we say we're following the US system, this is the US system. So here's another example of selective application of democratic principles that benefit the people who have designed the system. There's only two ways to make money. Only two ways. If anybody knows a third, let me know. One is increase your productivity. Two, reduce your cost. If we're not going to be able to increase our productivity, we've got to reduce our cost. And our cost of governance is way too much. This is only one example of how we might reduce our cost of governance. That's all I'll say on that, because I had only 40 minutes. So I'll move on to what I call community or village-based development. There's nothing new or earth-shattering about these things. Everything I'm talking about are things we have seen and experienced in other areas. Take a look at this graph. When you look at the US democratic system, there are 4 levels of government: federal, state, county, and municipal. All of you who live here in US, you live in towns and municipalities that have mayors and city councils, don't you? This is the system we have copied, but we have federal, state, county, which is a local government, and there is no local level governance. Who looks after a depot or Jatoaka? Whose job it is to plan the future of Naka? It's not the local government chairman. He's looking after the entire local government, like the sheriff. The villages where we come from, when do the villagers get together and develop plans for how they want to handle their future? Who is in charge of that? It's not the elders, that's cultural. It's not government, it doesn't exist. Why don't we have incorporated cities with mayors and town councils? A long time ago, the Igbos knew this. Almost every town in Igbo land had a town council. They would even build a town council. You can't create development or excellence by accident. It's got to be intentional. It's got to be deliberative. People have got to get together and say, what do we want? And how are we going to get it? Where does that happen in our villages? Who sits in Anyin and says, here's our plan 10 years from now? Well, if it's not happening, how do we expect it to develop? The local government chairman, we have seen that the local governments are just not going to be able to develop all the areas. But it's more than that. It's more than a void. We have a challenge when we don't have enough people who are learning to govern. If you have local government councils or people or town councils, people can learn governance. Governance is not something, or leadership is not something you just get up and become an expert. It takes a lot of learning. It takes a lot of trial and error. And sometimes you have to begin by trying it on a smaller scale. You master or learn the things that work, and then you can apply it at a larger scale. If you can't even govern your village, what makes you think you can govern a local government? If you can't govern a local government, what makes you think you can run a state? But that's what we're doing. Anybody wakes up in a village and says, I'm going to be the governor. They've never led anything. They've never done anything. How do we know they're going to be successful, or that they can be successful? So this lack of training ground, where we have a lack of leadership, training and development opportunities, lack of local planning, lack of development agenda, all these things have combined to create what psychologists, President Gillen would know this, it's called learned helplessness. People feel helpless or learned to become helpless. They are not able to cope. This is what we see with our villagers or with our folks back home. People ask you for help, or they say, do this for me. Well, what have you done to help yourself? And all of you, in talking to your relations, you can see what they can be doing. Surely a bag of soybean costs 30,000. If you can only grow 3 bags of soybean in a whole year, you have 100,000 naira. Somebody asks you for 300,000 naira. What are they doing to help themselves? We have embarked on this aspect of learner helplessness at an individual level, at a community level, and until we learn to figure out how to do things for ourselves, we do it at a national level. Here we see in MUTA, each time there's a case in Nigeria, we say, oh, we're going to complain to Joe Biden. Is Joe Biden your president? Joe Biden is the president of the US. How have you complained to the leaders that you've elected to run you before you go outside? These are all elements of learned helplessness, where people feel like somebody is going to come and help them. I'll stop about that. I also want to focus on this idea of limited priorities. Strictly speaking, the dictates of business are incompatible, inherently incompatible with what government is or should be doing. Business is about making money, right? I think Commissioner G knows this. Business is about making money. There's nobody who sets up a business and doesn't expect to make money. Then it's not a business. That's not the way government works. Government is about giving people representation and voice. There's no government in the world where you can take all the leaders from one family unless it's about representation. That's why we elect people. So government is about representation in all its forms. Representation of people, representation of government projects, and those are inherently inconsistent with what you need to do for business. So when I hear about our government leaders talking about establish industry and do this, I will say this, and I've said this many times, there is not a single government industry anywhere in the whole world that is profitable. If there's anyone who knows one example, I'd like to hear about it. Government businesses are never profitable and will never be profitable anywhere, not just in Nigeria. The role of government is to create the conditions to allow businesses to thrive, not to get into the business of creating businesses. We have seen this over and over. So the real purpose of government is to focus on things that are either unprofitable, so the market will not invest in them, or they are so critical to our survival that we don't want to give them into the hands of an individual. Roads, security, things like that. You don't want to outsource that to an individual because they may use it for their benefit. It's for a collective good. Almost everything else, markets can provide. Think about schools. Our schools are bad in Nigeria. What happens? People are opening up new schools, private schools that are so much better. Hospitals. Our hospitals are not, people are setting up hospitals. And guess what? If you created the conditions that makes it easier for people to create those things, even if your own people are not there to create it, other foreigners will come and create those things. And we're seeing this in Nigeria. The Indians are coming in to build hospitals for us. If we had some a more sane situation, we could get even more. So those are not the things government should be working on. Government should focus on a few limited things. Security. I asked previously on the first slide, why don't we have security in the Sustainable Development Goals? It's so basic. The kind of security situations, if a government cannot provide security for its people, that government has no right to exist. You don't have the legitimacy. It assumes that those already exist. And the kind of insecurity that we have in Nigeria, it's unique. There are no other countries that have this kind of insecurity. And we have people presiding over this who call themselves excellencies and your double honorables. We have also failed to provide some of the very basic things that our people need, and government should be assisting them. I apologize again for this. It looks very clear on my screen. I don't know where the problem, maybe it's in the translation. But what you're looking at is the amount of fertilizers that we apply on an acreage of farms. So 1 hectare of farm. The lowest number here is 70. So on average, globally, for the whole world, the average amount of fertilizers that farmers put on their farms is about 70 kilograms per hectare. That was 1970. Currently, I think it's about 150. That's the world average. Maybe it's a good thing that you can't see this. How many people know how much fertilizer we apply in Benue State on average on our farms per hectare? Any guesses? Less than 20 kilograms. We're the food basket of the nation. We put that on our number plates and we say we're the food basket of the nation. That is less fertilizer, 3 times less fertilizer than what the world average was 50 years ago. And we call ourselves the food basket of the nation. Do our leaders know this? Actually, Commissioner G was Commissioner for Agriculture. And natural resources. Oh, no, sorry. But it's not just agriculture. Security, which is the most basic. Abongo was Commissioner of Health. I should have put some data here too. Why not? Security. Take a look at this data, which is a listing of the most secure and the least secure countries in the world. See where we belong, with South Sudan, Afghanistan, Somalia, which has not had a government. Somalia has not had a government since 1991, right? Somaliland has had some element of government, but Somalia as a country has had no pretense. I'm not saying they've had a weak government. They've had no pretense of a government since 1991, 30 years ago. And our security is not much better than Somalia. Afghanistan, which has been in a war, our security and safety is not much better than Afghanistan. Sometimes I look at this data and I wonder, don't we have a sense of shame? Don't we have an ounce of self-pride? Is it that our people don't know this or they don't care? You are never going to have development if you don't have security. And so this is where I think if we're serious about talking about development, electricity consumption. In the whole world, every technology functions on electricity. If anybody knows a single technological gadget that can work without electricity, let me know. So electricity is a proxy for development because you need it. And so we can look at how much electricity different countries use. Iceland is at the top, but it's special. So again, we can't read this. Here, I think South Africa is around 3,500 kilowatts per hour of electricity. Nigeria, 147 kilowatt of electricity per person. This is 2022 data. The average person in South Africa is using electricity 100 times more than a Nigerian. How are you going to develop if we don't have electricity? So we need to identify what are the key dominoes that we can, if we focus on this, maybe we can build the foundation, either for government's efforts to have a larger impact, of the private sector to come and invest. And those include security, those includes electricity. So my recommendation would be that we focus on those, and of course, corruption. Again, we are in a very disreputable company with Lebanon, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Guinea. Is this where we belong? Is this where we want to belong? Those are the questions we need to. So I think our leaders, if they are serious, we need to set goals to be meaningfully, measurably something in something. And in Benue State, regardless of what Nigeria is doing, what if we decide we're going to be the safest state in Nigeria? Why don't we do that? Why don't we say, this is our goal. We are going to be the safest state in Nigeria, or the cleanest state, or the best governed state, maybe the best state for business investments. If you don't set goals, you're never going to achieve anything. If you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. What's our goal as a state, as a people, and how do we want to get there? The other point I'll mention is a sense of shared identity, shared values. These things matter. So in Benue State, we are Tiv, Idoma, I guess we have some other groups as well. What do the Tiv and the Idoma share in common, other than geography? What do we do in common? They have the Idoma Convention, we have our Tiv Convention. We go to the government to fight for resources, not to cooperate or collaborate. So why are we even in one state? What is it about Benue that both Tiv people and Idomas can look at and feel a sense of pride, a sense of ownership? At the beginning of this meeting, we sang the US anthem, we sang the Nigerian anthem. Have you noticed that a lot of states in the US have their own anthems, have their own songs, they have their own flags? So whoever within the state looks up and goes, that is ours, that belongs to us. You must create something that people share in common, feel that they are working towards in common, in order to make things happen. And so we don't have any of those. Within Tivland, we have the Yanonban principle, which works only when a politician that is not powerful is contesting. Doesn't seem to apply to Akume and Sosam and the other people. But the thing that worries me about Yanonban is it accepts and legitimizes clannishness. It says, if the person who is in charge is not from my group, I cannot expect the dividends of government. What does that mean? It means when I'm in charge, I have to deliver to the people in my group. So we create award ceremonies. We say, whoa, this Tiv person is a minister and he's had hundreds of Tiv people in his ministry. And we celebrate that and we clap for that. Well, guess what? He's not going to be a minister forever. The next person will be Mira. And what are they going to do? They are going to do the same. How long will it take before it becomes our turn, before we get anything? Is that the way we want to rule? We have done this at every level, not just at the governor's level. If I were in Nigeria today, I probably couldn't be a vice chancellor, because they will say, oh yeah, the last vice chancellor was from your area, you can't be from. There's not a single Nigerian professor in my entire university, not one. Not one Nigerian professor in my entire university, but I'm still the president. That's the difference of where merit matters. This is you're getting something because it's your turn. And you look at it is my turn. Yeah, but how long before it comes back to be your turn? Whether in the state or federal. Am I right on time?
No. So you have to get in there.
We need to evolve and teach symbols of unity. Symbols that people can feel they are part of, that represent us, things that unite us. Because right now, they don't exist. And professionalism. One of the things, I think the great ironies and tragedies of Nigeria is that cheating pays. In Nigeria, cheating pays with no consequences. There's nowhere where people obey the laws because they want to. They obey them because they have to. And if they don't, there are consequences. We have no consequences. People cheat and they win, and we celebrate them. And we honor them, and we respect them, and we fear, but no consequences. So why would anybody not cheat? In the land of lawlessness, it is a crime to be law-abiding. This is true. And everybody becomes a criminal. So we've got to remember to say, hey, we have to make cheating not pay. What is the agency at the federal level that's supposed to stop cheating or corruption? EFCC. EFCC. Why don't we have a state level agency targeted at corruption? Dr. Bonko, are we saying in the last 20 years that democracy has returned? How many people have our state prosecuted for corruption? Benue State. Why would it stop? Why don't we create an agency like that and actually, why don't we have a Bureau of Consumer Protection? I went home last year, I was trying to buy an iron rod for the project I was working on. The guy said it's 40 foot. The Igbo man, he said this one is 16 mm. It is 30 millimeters. The 16 mm was 40 feet. I had my tape. I measured it. It's 36. I said, okay, this is 36 feet. He said, we know. We just call it like that. If it is 36 feet, why don't you call it 36 feet? Why are you calling it 40 feet? Things like that really irritate, but we have normalized them. You go and buy, everybody says don't go and buy fuel there. That in meter to the wrong. But nothing happens to them. And of course, eventually they're the only people with fuel, so we go and buy. What's our government doing about that? What am I supposed to do as a citizen when I'm encountered by such blatant cheating? What are my options in the whole country? Where is development? What's the role of government when we can't do things like that? So, I'd like to conclude with a few take-home messages. I have been apologizing a lot in this meeting, but how many people know about Sinn Féin, the Irish group that was fighting? Well, now, does anybody know what Sinn Féin means? Literally, what does Sinn Féin mean? Sinn Féin means by ourselves alone, right? That's the translation, by ourselves alone. So the group understood our freedom is dependent on us. We are the ones that will free us. Now, the ways in which they went about it, we don't. This is something we have to understand. Sase omo nango namba fatio walenta wasoja. Sase. Our salvation is not coming from anywhere. It's not from God coming down. It's until we realize what our weaknesses are and we're serious about doing something about those weaknesses, nothing is going to happen. You can pray and go on hunger strike as many times as you want. Nothing is going to change until we follow the basic tenets of government. There are no shortcuts to development. There's no magic to it. People have to be accountable. People have to follow the rule. There is no shortcut. There are no countries, no societies in the world that have become developed, however you define it, without following these basic principles. And we are either not following those principles and we are not prepared to follow those principles. So, my take-home message, the fundamentals of our democratic governance our structures, our values, they all need to be reimagined. The path that we are on is a path to chaos and self-destruction. And that's where we are going to be headed. And I'd like to end with this quote that says, whether you think you can or you can't, you will. Yeah? Whether you think you can or you can't, you will. Basically, it says you will be what you think. If you say we can't, then you can't. If you say we can, then you will. I thought the governor was going to be here, so I was going to ask him a question, but maybe we'll put it to him. But change management is really difficult. I want to ask you all a question to take home. Do we know when we are undermining development? It's easy to look at what the government is doing and the politicians, but what about us? Each one of us is playing a role in undermining development. Do we know that? One of the things I have learned in administration is when you talk about change management, you want to change this, everybody says, yeah, let's change it. Oh, the budget is too much, let's cut the budget. I say, oh, I'm glad you agree. I'm going to cut your budget by $5. What? How dare you touch me? So when people talk about change management, they mean the other person should change, never about them. So when we talk about the things we need to do, we can point to the politicians and know what they should do, but what about us? Each one of us, in our own individual ways, is undermining the state, is undermining the society. Do we recognize that when we inflate contracts? Do we recognize that when we abuse our offices? The other day somebody told me, oh, don't worry about going to Nigeria. When you go, that his brother is a minister, he will send 4 or 6 policemen that will pick him at the airport. He is not worried about security. You are not a government official. Why are we using government security to protect you? And you live in this country where you don't get that protection. Why do you think that's normal? Do we recognize when we are undermining the government? Let's think about it. This is a question I had for Father Alia, and he's not here, but maybe I can ask him when he comes. Those of you never who can recall what Matthew 11:2-3 says.
There's my wife.
Your wife did me.
She may know.
I wanted to ask Alia what he thinks about these types of ideas and whether he is the one that was to come, or if we have to wait for another one. But apparently he's not here, so we may have to ask him that.
Look at some of the comments. Effectively serve every member of that population. I think Nigeria has the potential to use its population as an advantage rather than as a burden. And what I see, as you mentioned, frightens me because I don't think we're making any preparation for the storm that is to come. This can turn into something that will just consume that society. Because when you have a huge population, especially young people without any skills, then you have doomed yourself. I see some glimmers of hope, but I think it's incumbent on every one of us to make even the least effort to try and move the Nigerian project forward. On the revenue side, you mentioned something about increasing efficiency or reducing your cost. that population could be something that you can use to generate a lot of revenue. You can increase your efficiency and reduce your cost by investing in that population very early. And for what I'm seeing as our investment in education, it's not very encouraging. But I implore everyone here to take it upon themselves to make an effort, especially within our state, to make sure that the primary schools at least get back to functioning. The other thing I think probably you never touched on is the aversion for data. I have never seen any society grow or function without having the data. Without the data, how can you figure out how you're growing or you're not growing? And our leaders have an aversion for data. They dismiss it offhandedly. They don't even make an effort to garner some of the information that can help them get to the goal where they want to arrive. I thank you very much. This has been a real awakening for me, and I hope that you will come back from time to time, at least to judge some of us and employ us to invest in our communities.
Thank you. I think that was a comment, not a question. So.
That's a fair response. I agree.
So please, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please first identify yourself. Let's know who you are. Sir.
Thank you. John Alla here. Thank you for your presentation, very informative. I think a lot of that data I've never seen before either, and I'm sure a lot of us here haven't. I'm an advocate for change, especially in our society. And a few things you said, I had questions. I almost jumped up to ask a question, but I said, okay, let me wait, because maybe I might be taking it wrong, and let me hear everything you have to say. One thing that I stand strong on, in this society, and I've said this plenty of times, there's a lack of mentorship. It's a lack of mentorship. When we grew up back home as kids, we grew up in a culture. You're being taught your culture. You go to school and come home and you do everything else to you, okay? And so that doesn't change when you now get into a bigger society to take this culture and move this culture forward, which means that we still owe responsibility to people to mentor them, to get them to where they need to be, to the best potential of our people, not even them, because the best people we can create, the best society that we have. So one thing you said that I wanted to ask was, I just kind of went off track, but you said you're a president at a university, and very proudly there's no team man there.
No Nigerian.
No Nigerian, as a matter of fact.
Not proudly. He just stated
Well, it was proud, which is still good, because he did cover that point, which he said it was based on merit,
Yeah.
which is okay. There's no problem with that.
Yeah.
But now my issue is, how do we get ourselves there? How come are we saying that there's no Nigerian? Are we saying there's no T person qualified on merit? What are we saying? What I'm saying is we're not being deliberate. We're not. And it's not just Wilson right here, it's all of us. We're guilty of this. We can point to ourselves and say how many of us have held a child's hand here and taken them to where they need to go. Yes, there's a few of us, but it's not deliberate either. We're doing it out of our kindness. We're doing it out of our strength of how much we can do, but it's not deliberate. It has to be a deliberate change to make a change. And so that's the question I had for you. Thank you.
Can you repeat
No, he will answer first. And then we'll
I think he understands the question.
Let me chew on this. Let's have another person ask, so I can chew on it. I'm not ignoring it. I want to chew on it.
Msutio, my name is Reginald Rafa. I'm based in the New Jersey area of the United States. A wonderful presentation, Professor. I love
luego computer y después over to us.